What if WW2 ended in a draw? May 8, 1945. In our world, this is Victory in Europe Day. Cities erupt in celebration. Soldiers embrace strangers. Churchill stands before crowds in London. Stalin raises a glass in Moscow. Hitler is dead. The Nazi regime has collapsed. The war in Europe is over. But what if it wasn't? What if, instead of surrender, there was silence? What if the guns stopped, not because one side had won, but because everyone was too broken to continue? What if the bloodiest conflict in human history simply ground to a halt, leaving borders frozen, armies exhausted, and the world divided not by victory and defeat, but by mutual collapse? This isn't a story about peace. It's a story about a wound that never closes, a conflict that never resolves, a world that stumbles into an armistice without justice, without accountability, without the catharsis of surrender. It's a world where Nazis remain in power, where war crimes go unpunished, where every nation lives in permanent fear because no one truly won and no one truly lost. This is a world without moral clarity, without closure, without the institutions we built from the ashes of total war, and it's a world that might be darker than the one we inherited. Let's begin with how we get there. In our timeline, World War II ends with unconditional surrender. Germany surrenders in May 1945. Japan surrenders in August after 2 atomic bombs. The Axis powers are completely defeated, occupied, and rebuilt. The Allied victory is total. But this outcome isn't inevitable. There are moments, particularly between 1943 and 1944, when the war could have gone differently. Not necessarily an Axis victory, but a stalemate, a frozen conflict where neither side can land the final blow. Let's establish the conditions that create this draw. First, Germany. In our timeline, Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944, succeeds. Allied forces establish a foothold in Normandy and begin pushing toward Germany. By spring of 1945, they're crossing the Rhine. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, is advancing from the east, crushing German armies and driving toward Berlin. Germany is caught in a vice. Its defeat is inevitable. But what if D-Day fails? This isn't impossible. The invasion is one of the most complex military operations in history. It depends on weather, timing, deception, and luck. Eisenhower himself drafts a statement taking responsibility in case it goes wrong. The Germans have built extensive fortifications along the French coast. They have experienced divisions nearby. If the Allies can't secure the beaches in the first critical hours, if German reinforcements arrive faster, and if Rommel is present instead of away for his wife's birthday, the invasion could be thrown back into the sea. In this timeline, that's what happens. The Allies land on June 6th, but German resistance is fiercer than expected. Rommel arrives quickly and coordinates a devastating counterattack. Within 3 days, the beachhead collapses. Thousands of Allied soldiers are killed or captured. The invasion is a catastrophic failure. Churchill is devastated. Roosevelt faces enormous political pressure. Stalin, who has been demanding a second front for years, is furious. The Western Allies try again in 1945, but Germany has reinforced the Atlantic Wall. Another invasion attempt fails. The cost in lives is unsustainable. Public opinion in Britain and America begins to turn against continued offensives. Meanwhile, in the East, the Soviet Union is still advancing, but more slowly. In our timeline, the Red Army's success is partly due to Germany fighting a 2-front war. But in this timeline, with no Western front after D-Day fails, Germany can concentrate more forces in the East. The Soviets still advance. They're too powerful to stop entirely, but their progress is measured in miles instead of hundreds of miles. By mid-1945, they've reached Poland and eastern Germany, but they've taken staggering casualties. Soviet losses are already over 20 million. Stalin faces his own pressures. The Soviet economy is on the brink of collapse. The population is exhausted. Now let's turn to the Pacific. In our timeline, the United States island-hopping campaign steadily pushes Japan back. By August 1945, the U.S. has taken Okinawa and is preparing to invade Japan itself. but the casualties at Okinawa are horrific. American planners estimate that invading the Japanese home islands could cost 1 million Allied casualties. Instead, the atomic bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrenders. But in this timeline, things unfold differently. The Manhattan Project is delayed. Perhaps a key scientist dies in an accident. Perhaps a critical material shipment is lost. The atomic bomb isn't ready by August 1945. It won't be ready until late 1946 at the earliest. Without the bomb, the United States faces the prospect of invading Japan. But after the failures in Europe, after years of war, American public opinion is shifting. The U.S. has pushed Japan back to its home islands and cut off its access to resources. A blockade could starve Japan into submission eventually, but it would take years. And Japan, despite its desperate situation, shows no signs of surrendering. The military government in Tokyo believes that if they can inflict enough casualties on the Americans, they can force a negotiated peace. By late 1945, the war has been raging for 6 years. Every major combatant is exhausted, economies are shattered, millions are dead, and crucially, no side can deliver a knockout blow. Germany can't win. It's being pushed back on the Eastern Front. Its cities are being bombed day and night, but it also can't be defeated quickly. Its industrial capacity, though damaged, is still functioning. Its armies, though battered, are still fighting. And the Allies can't invade Western Europe. The Soviet Union is advancing, but slowly and at tremendous cost. Stalin's position at home is secure, but the Soviet people are suffering. There's a limit to how much more they can endure. Japan is isolated and starving, but still fighting. An invasion would be a bloodbath. A blockade would take years. The Western Allies, Britain and the United States, are war-weary. Britain is nearly bankrupt. The U.S. public wants their soldiers home. And so, in the winter of 1945, something unprecedented happens. Quiet diplomatic channels open, not through official declarations, but through neutral countries. Switzerland, Sweden, Turkey, back-channel communications exploring the possibility of an armistice. No one calls it surrender. No one admits defeat. But everyone acknowledges that the war can't continue like this. The negotiations are secret at first. If the public knew their governments were talking to the enemy, the backlash would be enormous. But by early 1946, the talks become official. Representatives from Germany, the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and Japan meet in Stockholm. The negotiations are brutal. Every side wants to claim some form of victory. Every side refuses to admit fault. The moral clarity that defines our timeline's end to World War II is completely absent here. Germany is represented not by a defeated nation, but by a regime still in power. Hitler, in this timeline, is still alive, though his health is failing. The Nazi leadership refuses to surrender unconditionally. They agree to stop fighting, but they demand that Germany retain control over the territories it holds in early 1946. This is a staggering demand. In this timeline, Germany still controls most of Poland, parts of the Baltic states, and significant portions of Western Soviet territory. It has been pushed out of France and Italy, but it holds Czechoslovakia, Austria, and much of the Balkans. The Nazis are still in power, the concentration camps are still operating, and the Western Allies are being asked to accept this as the price of peace. The Soviets are furious. They've lost over 20 million people fighting Germany. Stalin demands that Germany withdraw from all Soviet territory and that war criminals be handed over for trial. But Germany refuses, and the Western Allies, exhausted and unable to invade Europe, can't force the issue. After months of negotiation, a compromise is reached. Germany withdraws from the deepest Soviet territories, but retains control of Poland, the Baltic states, and a strip of Western Soviet land. In exchange, Germany agrees to a ceasefire. The concentration camps are to be closed. Jewish survivors and other prisoners are to be released. But there's no occupation of Germany, no regime change, no denazification. The Nazi government remains in power, though the worst atrocities are supposed to end. In the Pacific, Japan negotiates from a similarly defiant position. The Japanese military government refuses to surrender the emperor or accept occupation. They agree to withdraw from China proper and the Philippines, which they can no longer hold anyway. But they retain Korea, Taiwan, and parts of coastal China. The puppet state of Manchukuo remains under Japanese influence. There is no occupation of Japan. No war crimes trials for Japanese leaders. The United States, facing the prospect of 1 million casualties in an invasion, accepts. It's a bitter pill. The American public is divided. Many are outraged, but many others just want their sons home. Britain, nearly bankrupt and facing the collapse of its empire, has little choice but to accept. Churchill, if he's still in power, is deeply troubled. He knows this isn't a real peace, but Britain can't continue alone. By mid-1946, the armistice is signed. The guns fall silent. Soldiers begin the long journey home. But there are no victory parades, no celebrations in the streets, just exhaustion and a deep, unsettling sense that nothing has been resolved. The war is over, but no one won. The immediate aftermath of the armistice is chaos. In Europe, borders are redrawn, but not cleanly. Poland, a nation that was invaded and destroyed, simply ceases to exist as an independent state. It's divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Polish government in exile in London is powerless. Millions of Poles are trapped under Nazi or Soviet rule. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, are split. The Soviets control the eastern parts. Germany controls the western coasts. These nations, independent just a decade earlier, are now bargaining chips. Czechoslovakia remains under German domination. The same is true for Austria, which was annexed in 1938. The Balkans are a patchwork of German, Soviet, and local control. Yugoslavia is divided. Greece is unstable. And the concentration camps. According to the armistice, they are supposed to be closed. Jewish survivors are supposed to be released. But who's enforcing this? There's no occupation force. No Allied military on German soil. The Nazis remain in power. They release some prisoners, enough to satisfy the armistice terms. But many camps continue to operate, rebranded as labor camps or detention centers. The genocide doesn't end cleanly. It tapers off, but the machinery remains. By 1947, it's estimated that Germany releases perhaps half of the surviving Jewish prisoners. The other half disappears into a bureaucratic nightmare. Some are sent to forced labor camps. Others are expelled and left to wander. As refugees, the exact numbers are never known because there's no full accounting, no Nuremberg trials, no systematic investigation. This is one of the darkest aspects of the draw. In our timeline, the Holocaust is exposed to the world. The Nuremberg trials document the atrocities. The evidence is preserved. Justice, however imperfect, is served. The world says never again. But in this timeline, there are no trials. Some Nazi leaders die of natural causes. Others live out their lives in Germany. A few are quietly assassinated by Jewish resistance groups, but most escape accountability. The full scale of the Holocaust isn't revealed until decades later, when historians finally piece together what happened. By then, most of the perpetrators are dead. In Asia, the situation is similarly grim. Japan retains control over Korea and Taiwan. The occupation is brutal. Comfort women, forced laborers, and political prisoners are supposed to be freed under the armistice. Some are, but Japan, like Germany, isn't fully held accountable. There's no Tokyo trial, no occupation that forces Japan to confront its war crimes. The rape of Nanking, the biological warfare experiments of Unit 731, the mass starvation in occupied territories, all of this remains hidden or minimized by the Japanese government. It takes decades before the truth begins to emerge, and even then, Japan's official position remains defensive. The result is a world without moral clarity. In our timeline, World War II ends with a clear distinction between good and evil. The Axis committed atrocities. The Allies stopped them. It's not a perfect narrative. The Allies had their own crimes, but the basic moral framework is sound. In this timeline, that framework doesn't exist. The Nazis are still in power. The Japanese military government is still in power. The atrocities are acknowledged in whispers, but not in courts. There's no global reckoning. No moment where humanity collectively says, this can never happen again. Instead, there's just exhaustion and uneasy coexistence. In our timeline, the end of World War II leads to the creation of the United Nations. Founded in October 1945, the UN is meant to prevent future global conflicts. It's flawed, certainly. The Security Council gives veto power to the great powers, which limits its effectiveness, but it still represents a commitment to international cooperation. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is adopted in 1948. The Geneva Conventions are updated to protect civilians and prisoners of war. International law, however imperfect, is strengthened. The Nuremberg Principles establish that following orders is not a defense for war crimes. The world builds institutions designed to prevent another catastrophic war. But in the timeline where World War II ends in a draw, none of this happens. There's an attempt to create an international organization. Diplomats meet in San Francisco in 1946, just as in our timeline. But the negotiations collapse almost immediately. Germany and Japan demand seats as equal powers. The Soviet Union refuses to participate in any organization that includes fascist states. The United States and Britain are caught in the middle. A watered-down version of the UN is eventually created, but it's toothless, has no enforcement mechanism, no moral authority. Germany and Japan are members, sitting alongside the nations they invaded. The organization becomes a forum for propaganda, not peacekeeping. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is proposed, but it's blocked. Germany and Japan refuse to sign any document that could be used to prosecute their war crimes. The Soviet Union, never enthusiastic about human rights, doesn't push the issue. The declaration dies in committee. International law remains what it was before the war, a collection of treaties that nations follow when convenient and ignore when not. There's no Nuremberg precedent, no legal framework for prosecuting crimes against humanity. The very concept of crimes against humanity struggles to gain traction because the most egregious criminals are still in power. This has profound consequences. In our timeline, the post-war international order, for all its flaws, creates a framework for addressing atrocities. The Yugoslav wars of the 1990s lead to war crimes tribunals. The Rwandan genocide is prosecuted. The International Criminal Court is established. It's slow, imperfect, and often ignored, but it exists. In this timeline, none of that infrastructure is built. When atrocities occur, there's no international response, no tribunals, no accountability. The strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must, and the world shrugs. In our timeline, the major powers demobilize after World War II. Not completely, of course. The Cold War begins almost immediately, and tensions remain high. But the massive armies of World War II are reduced. Millions of soldiers return home. Economies shift from war production to civilian goods. But in a timeline where the war ends in a draw, demobilization is impossible. Think about it. Germany is still controlled by the Nazis. It still has ambitions. It still believes in its racial ideology and its right to dominate. The armistice is, from the Nazi perspective, a temporary setback. They begin rebuilding immediately. By 1948, Germany has reconstituted much of its military. Factories that were damaged are repaired. New weapons are designed. The German military isn't as large as it was during the war, but it's still formidable. The Soviet Union, sitting across a frozen border from Germany, can't demobilize either. Stalin keeps millions of men under arms. Soviet industry remains on a war footing. The Soviet Union isn't at war, but it's not at peace either. It's in a state of permanent readiness. The same is true in Asia. Japan retains control over Korea and coastal China. The United States can't simply withdraw from the Pacific. It maintains a massive military presence, naval bases, air bases, hundreds of thousands of troops stationed across the Pacific to ensure Japan doesn't resume expansion. Britain, despite its economic exhaustion, is forced to maintain a large military as well. Its empire is crumbling, and it needs military force to hold it together. India, which in our timeline gains independence in 1947, is held by force for years longer. British troops suppress independence movements in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. The result is a world where every major power remains heavily militarized. Defense spending doesn't decline after the war. It stays high or increases. Economies are distorted by the constant need to maintain large standing armies. This has social consequences. In our timeline, the soldiers who fought in World War II return home and become the foundation of a prosperous middle class. The GI Bill in the United States provides education and housing. Similar programs exist in other countries. The post-war economic boom is built, in part, by veterans reintegrating into civilian life. But in this timeline, many soldiers don't come home. They're stationed along frozen borders, in occupied territories and distant bases. Those who do return home often struggle. There's no economic boom. The economies are still focused on defense. Jobs are scarce. The psychological trauma of the war, what we'd now call PTSD, is widespread and untreated. Veterans become a lost generation, unable to readjust to a society that never stopped preparing for war. And then there are the weapons. In our timeline, the atomic bomb is used twice. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The horror of these weapons ends the war but also creates a taboo. Nuclear weapons become the ultimate deterrent, too terrible to use. The Cold War is defined by the fear of mutual assured destruction, but that fear also prevents direct conflict between superpowers. In the timeline where World War II ends in a draw, the nuclear age begins differently. Remember, in this timeline, the atomic bomb isn't ready by August 1945. The Manhattan Project continues, and by late 1946, the United States has a working bomb. But there's no war to end. The armistice is already in place. So what does the U.S. do with the bomb? It tests it. In July 1947, the first atomic test takes place in New Mexico, just as in our timeline. But the context is different. The U.S. isn't a victor demonstrating its power. It's a nation in an uneasy standoff with multiple adversaries. The announcement of the atomic bomb sends shockwaves through the world. Germany and the Soviet Union immediately accelerate their own nuclear programs. Japan, despite its economic struggles, pours resources into nuclear research. By 1950, the United States has a small arsenal of atomic bombs. By 1952, the Soviet Union tests its first bomb. Germany, which captured scientists and research during the war, tests its bomb in 1954. Japan, with help from captured German research, follows in 1956. Within a decade of the war's end, 4 hostile powers have nuclear weapons. And unlike in our timeline, there's no Cold War framework to manage this. There's no clear bipolar world. Instead, it's multipolar chaos. The US and Soviets aren't aligned against a common enemy. Germany and Japan aren't defeated and occupied. They're independent, hostile powers with nuclear weapons. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction exists, but it's applied to a world with 4 nuclear powers, not 2. Any conflict between any 2 of them could escalate to nuclear war. And unlike the Cold War, where the US and Soviets developed protocols, hotlines, and arms control treaties to prevent accidental war, there is no such cooperation here. The hostility is too deep, the distrust too great. By the 1960s, all 4 powers have hydrogen bombs. Arsenals grow into the thousands. And there's no arms control, no treaties. The world lives under a nuclear shadow far darker than in our timeline. In our timeline, the Cold War is a singular conflict. The United States and the Soviet Union, capitalism versus communism, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. It's dangerous, but it's also structured. Proxy wars are fought, but direct conflict is avoided. In the timeline where World War II ends in a draw, there isn't one Cold War. There are several. By the 1960s, the world is exhausted by conflict. There hasn't been another global war, but there hasn't been peace either. Every continent has active war zones, proxy conflicts are everywhere, and the nuclear shadow hangs over everything. What does daily life look like in this world? For most people, it's defined by fear and scarcity. In the Soviet Union, Stalin rules until his death in 1953. His successors, just as in our timeline, relax some of the worst aspects of Stalinist terror. But the Soviet economy, burdened by massive military spending and the need to compete with 3 other nuclear powers, never develops as quickly as in our timeline. The standard of living remains low. Dissent is crushed. Europe is divided not by the Iron Curtain of our timeline, but by multiple barriers. Travel between countries is difficult. Refugees, millions of them, remain in camps decades after the war. The continent never unites. The European Union, which in our timeline emerges from a desire to make war between European nations impossible, never forms. Instead, Europe remains what it was before World War I, a collection of suspicious, heavily armed states. One of the most haunting aspects of this timeline is the absence of justice. In our timeline, the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, however imperfect, establish a principle. Leaders can be held accountable for crimes against humanity. The Holocaust is documented. The world sees the evidence. Survivors testify. The truth is preserved. But in this timeline, there are no trials. The Holocaust is acknowledged, vaguely, in history books, but the full scale isn't revealed for decades. Many survivors emigrate to Palestine or the Americas, but millions are trapped in Europe. They live in the same countries where their families were murdered, often mere miles from concentration camps that have been repurposed or demolished. There's no public reckoning, no memorials, no museums. The memory of the Holocaust is kept alive by survivors and their descendants, but it's not part of the official narrative. Textbooks in Germany mention the war, but gloss over the genocide. It's referred to as a tragic chapter, not the systematic extermination it was. This creates a strange, distorted culture. In Germany, there are people who know what happened. They whisper about it, but publicly, the state denies the full extent. In the 1960s, when a new generation of Germans begins asking questions, the state suppresses the inquiry. It's not until the 1980s, when the Nazi regime finally begins to collapse under its own contradictions, that the truth starts to emerge. By then, almost all the perpetrators are dead. In Japan, the situation is similar. The comfort women, the forced laborers, the victims of Unit 731, their stories are suppressed. Some survivors speak out, but they're ignored or dismissed. It's not until the 1990s that Japan begins, reluctantly, to acknowledge its war crimes. Even then, the acknowledgement is partial, grudging, insufficient. This absence of justice poisons the world. There's no closure, no healing, the victims are denied recognition, the perpetrators escape accountability, and future generations inherit a world where atrocities can be committed with impunity. By the 1970s, the armistice is nearly 30 years old. An entire generation has grown up in this strange, frozen world, but the tensions haven't eased. If anything, they've intensified. The 1980s arrive. The armistice is 40 years old. The generation that fought the war is dying. New leaders are in power, and the world is more unstable than ever. In Germany, the post-coup government is trying to reform, but it's facing resistance from hardliners. There are internal conflicts, economic problems. The state is slowly losing control. In the Soviet Union, the Brezhnev era is ending. The economy is stagnant. The military budget is unsustainable. There are calls for reform, similar to Gorbachev's perestroika in our timeline, but the situation is more dangerous because the Soviet Union faces threats on multiple fronts. In Japan, the military government has been replaced by a civilian one, but Japan is struggling. The occupation of Korea is increasingly untenable. Korean resistance, now in its fourth decade, has broad popular support. Japan is bleeding resources into a conflict it can't win. The United States is wealthier and more stable than the other powers, but it's exhausted. Decades of permanent militarization have taken their toll. There's a growing movement advocating for withdrawal, for letting the rest of the world sort out its own problems. And the nuclear arsenals keep growing. By the 1980s, there are over 50,000 nuclear warheads in the world, divided among 4 hostile powers. Arms control has failed. Every attempt at negotiation collapses in mutual distrust. The world is waiting for the next crisis. Everyone knows it's coming. The question is not if, but when. By the year 2000, in our timeline, the world has changed dramatically from 1945. The Cold War is over, the Berlin Wall has fallen, the European Union has expanded, democracy has spread, technology has connected the globe. There are still problems, conflicts, injustices, but there's also progress. But in the timeline where World War II ended in a draw, the year 2000 looks very different. Germany is no longer controlled by the Nazis. The regime finally collapsed in the early 1990s, not because of external pressure, but because of internal contradictions. But what replaced it is a weak, fractured state. Parts of former Nazi Germany have become independent. There's no strong, unified Germany, just a collection of smaller states, still dealing with the legacy of 50 years of fascism. The Soviet Union also collapsed, just as in our timeline, but the collapse was more violent. Without the stabilizing influence of a single clear adversary, the breakup led to multiple civil wars. Russia exists, but it's weaker and more isolated. Japan finally withdrew from Korea in the 1990s after decades of guerrilla warfare. Korea is independent but devastated. The scars of 50 years of occupation will take generations to heal. The United States is the most stable of the major powers, but it's turned inward. The cost of decades of global military presence with no clear victory has soured Americans on international involvement. There's a strong isolationist sentiment. The world in the year 2000 is less connected, less prosperous, less hopeful than in our timeline. International institutions are weak or non-existent. Human rights are a concept that's discussed but rarely enforced. The global economy is fragmented. And hanging over everything is the knowledge that it could all fall apart again, because the underlying problems were never resolved. The armistice of 1946 didn't solve anything. It just froze the conflict. And in this timeline, the ice is beginning to crack. Here's what we've learned. A draw in World War II doesn't give us peace. It gives us a permanent state of tension. It gives us a world where the worst crimes of the 20th century go unpunished, where the perpetrators remain in power, where justice is denied. It gives us a world with more nuclear weapons, more militarization, more proxy wars, a world where international cooperation fails because there's no shared victory to build upon, where human rights law never develops because the criminals write the rules. It gives us a world that never heals, never moves on, never gets closure. In our timeline, World War II was a catastrophe, but it ended decisively. The Axis was defeated. The atrocities were exposed. Justice, however imperfect, was served. The world built institutions designed to prevent it from happening again. Those institutions are flawed, often ineffective, but they exist. We look back at World War II, and we see the worst of humanity, but we also see the possibility of redemption. We see societies that committed terrible crimes eventually confront them, eventually change. Germany became a democracy. Japan became a democracy. The world, slowly, fitfully, learned. But in the timeline where the war ends in a draw, that learning never happens. The criminals remain in power, the victims are forgotten, and the world stumbles forward, weighted down by unresolved trauma, waiting for the next disaster. Because here's the final uncomfortable truth. The draw doesn't prevent the next war. It makes it more likely. When World War II ends in our timeline, the horror is so complete, so total, that it creates a genuine desire to prevent it from happening again. The nuclear age brings fear, but that fear prevents direct conflict between superpowers for half a century. But in the timeline of the draw, there's no such clarity. The war ended in exhaustion, not horror. There's no moment of reckoning, no photographs of liberated concentration camps shocking the world into action, no mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, demonstrating the ultimate price of war. Instead, there's just weariness, and weariness fades, memories dim. New leaders emerge who didn't live through the war, and they start to think maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. By the early 21st century, the world created by the armistice of 1946 is collapsing. The institutions are failing, the borders are contested, the alliances are fracturing, and the weapons are ready. In our timeline, we learned from World War II. We learned what happens when evil goes unchecked, when appeasement fails, when the world doesn't stand together against atrocity. But in this timeline, those lessons were never learned. The war ended before the lessons could be taught. And so, as we move into the 21st century in this alternate world, the question isn't whether there will be another global conflict. The question is when. And whether this time, anyone will survive to remember what we failed to learn.